One day, we decided to meet up early in the evening and have dinner, then have a few quiet ones in the plaza as it was a midweek, maybe a Tuesday or a Wednesday. As usual, after dinner, we headed to the Red Rose for a beer. Upon entrance, Steve immediately noticed a girl who he had never seen before and pointed her out to me. This one kind of broke the mould as she was very pretty and petite. Again, for the sake of the story, we'll call her Ploy. The story goes that it was Ploy's first ever night working in a bar in Bangkok. She had one young daughter back in Isan and had been abused by her estranged husband. According to the owner of the bar, who we knew well, she hadn't ever been bar fined as it was her first night in the bar. We had no reason to think this was untrue as we had never seen her in the Rose Bar before. However, obviously, she could have come from another bar in another part of Bangkok or another city, but she was very shy. You could tell from her nervous smile when we looked at her. Steve was the kind of guy that even if he didn't find her attractive, he would have bar fined her anyway. It would have given him satisfaction knowing that he had been her first customer in the bar. But things turned out very different from a short-term transaction, which is what we would normally happen. Both Steve and me had heard all the stories that the bar girls normally tell you when you're in a bar. You know the kind of thing. I've only just started in this bar tonight, or I don't go out with customers, I just make money on the commission from the drinks. I have a sick mother, so I'm working to buy her medicine, the normal sort of stuff. Steve bought Ploy a drink. Her English was nearly non-existent and there were no translation apps back then, so I don't know how they have communicated. Steve paid Ploy's bar fine. I ended up staying in Nana Plaza by myself, but eventually met a little cutie who kept me entertained that night. I didn't think anything unusual about our night out last night as we had both met someone and gone our separate ways. This was normal. Over the next few weeks, we tended to stay in the Rose Bar longer than we normally had, which I kind of found irritating and boring because although it was a nice quiet bar to have the first beer in, it wasn't the sort of place you'd want to spend a couple of hours in. Steve was getting into a habit of paying Ploy's bar fine as soon as he arrived at the bar. Then we'd go off, hit some go-go bars, and Steve would go back to the Rose Bar to pick up Ploy. This was happening more and more, and eventually I told Steve that I would hit a few bars by myself, and when he was ready to meet up, he could call me. These were the days where the mobile phone was just starting to come into existence. I think we both had the original Nokias. Remember those little brick phones about 4 inches long? Anyway, after a while, I noticed Steve didn't want to come out as often as we had been going out in the evenings. When I phoned him in the afternoon, there would always be some reason why he didn't want to meet up. He was feeling tired, he'd been shopping all day, he was expecting a phone call from his son in England, or he was meeting a lady he had met in the daytime in a shopping mall. Don't get me wrong, he would still meet me and we would still go out, but it was just getting less and less frequent. After a while, it kind of fizzled out to the point where I gave up calling him as he would always have an excuse as to why he didn't want to go out. So I would meet up with other friends. We still chatted now and again. He would call me in the afternoon or I would call him and we would have a long conversations about what we had done the previous day and so on. One Sunday afternoon, I think it was, I wasn't doing a lot, so I called Steve and I said, look, it's been ages since we've met up. Why don't we meet up for lunch one day in the week and we can catch up? To which he agreed. After lunch, we decided to go somewhere quiet and have a coffee. It was while having coffee that I pressed Steve and said, look, you're not the same. What's happened? Do I put it down to old age or do you have some problems going on? I'm your best friend. You can trust me. If you have any issues or problems, maybe I can help. That's when Steve confessed everything to me. He went on to explain that he had fallen deeply and madly in love with Ploy. At first, it had been purely physical and nothing more than that. He went on to explain that over time he had fallen head over heels for Ploy and couldn't stand the thought of her leaving the bar with other guys. Unbeknown to me, he had moved Ploy into his apartment, which explains why he was no longer going out in the evenings. It all made sense to me now. Steve's reasoning was that he wouldn't have problems like other guys who have dated bar girls, as she only started in the bar that first night when we had met her and hadn't been exposed to other farangs. I said, Steve, look, how do you know she didn't go out on short time after you paid her bar fine and got back before the end of the night? If she wasn't there and you got there first, she could have simply said she'd nipped out for something to eat. How can you be sure that she didn't work in another bar in some other entertainment venue? It was like talking to a brick wall. I just couldn't get through to him. He had made up his mind and had decided that Ploy was the love of his life. Something I didn't mention was that Steve was 60 at the time and Ploy had just turned 40. I didn't really see too much of Steve after that lunch. However, we did keep in touch by phone and he would always update me and tell me how happy he was living with Ploy. She hadn't raised any red flags and he had no reason to suspect anything. I was fully expecting to receive a call from Steve one day telling me how she had robbed his apartment or gone off with another farang, but I never did get that phone call. The next bit of news from Steve was even more shocking than what he had told me over that last lunch. Steve decided he was going to move back to the UK full time. He was going to take Ploy with him, marry her, and take Ploy's daughter to the UK also, who had been living with them in Steve's apartment in Bangkok. What could I say? I wished him the best of luck and told him to keep in touch, which he promised he would. The day finally came for Steve, Ploy, and her daughter to fly out of the old Dong Muang airport to start a new life in the UK. Good to his word, Steve did keep in touch and would occasionally send me an email with details of what was going on in their lives. So far, so good, according to him. This was when email was in its infancy. I think we were using Windows 3.1 back then. After about a year of Steve moving back to the UK, my employment in Bangkok had also come to an end and I was unable to find a similar job in Thailand, so I made the decision to also head back to the UK. About 5 years had passed and I hadn't heard anything from Steve. I had lost his email address, so couldn't contact him. I was sure he would contact me sometime in the future. So I would have his email address again, but he never did. Anyway, one day, out of the blue, I get an email and it's from Ploy. The English was far from perfect, but I understood most of the message. Ploy told me that she got my email address off Steve's computer. Ploy went on to explain to me that Steve had died several weeks earlier of a massive heart attack. This news was devastating to me, as Steve had been my best friend in Thailand, and although I hadn't spoken to him for years, it really made me sad when I heard the news. Ploy and I exchanged several emails, and the story goes something like this. Not long after arriving in the UK, Steve bought a very nice house in a town called Oxford and paid for it cash. The house had been paid for fully, so had no mortgage left on it. Steve had also set up a trust fund for Ploy's daughter to go to a private school later on in life when she was a bit older. Steve was a fairly well-off guy, so I know he probably had several £100,000 in his bank account, which Ploy would now have access to. In a nutshell, Ploy had been left a wealthy widow with a house that she now owned, a lot of money in the bank, a car, jewellery, and of course the trust fund for her daughter. I found all this out later, but back to the story at the point of the first email that I received from Ploy. I asked Ploy when Steve's funeral was taking place and would she mind if I came along and paid my respects. Ploy was very happy for me to go along to Steve's funeral and also suggested I come back to the house where she would be holding a small party for friends. On the day I attended Steve's funeral, it was winter, so very cold. It was a very sad occasion for me personally, as I had so many fond memories of the good times Steve and I had had together in Bangkok. It's surprising how many memories flood the brain when you're in a situation like that. It was difficult for me to hold back my tears, as he had been a good friend, and although I hadn't seen him for years, I felt that I had lost someone very close to me. After the funeral, we all headed back to Ploy's house, where there was a lot of Thai food laid out on a table. This is when I first met Chris, Steve's son. Chris was a nice guy, but he went on to tell me that he really never liked Ploy and felt there was something not right about her. Steve was quite angry that Ploy would receive much of his father's estate. Chris was the one who told me about Steve's finances. I was quite surprised how open he was about discussing his father's financial situation. I suppose he just wanted to speak to someone about it, and Steve had mentioned to Chris that we had been good friends in Thailand. So this part of the story was done and dusted for me. I went back home and carried on with my life. I never really heard anything about Ploy until years later. A few years later, I had taken a vacation for a month and I had gone to Thailand and looked up some old friends who had known Steve. This part of the story is second-hand information, but I believe it to all be true as I've heard the same story from several different people. Apparently, after Steve's death, Ploy sold the family home in Oxford, sold the car, emptied her son's trust fund along with Steve's bank account. Ploy then returned to Thailand with her daughter and went to live for a while up country where she was from. Apparently, she paid cash to have a house built for her mother in Isan. She also bought a brand new pickup truck for her brother and generally spent a lot of cash while in Isan. Ploy eventually moved back to Bangkok and left her daughter with her mother to take care of. Ploy opened a massage parlour with what money she had left. Apparently, she also liked to gamble. The massage parlour was located somewhere around Sukhumvit, but for some reason it didn't work out and she lost all of the money that she had invested. Probably it was a bad location off some side street. Desperate for money and now approaching 50, Ploy took a job in a beer bar on Soi 4 where apparently she still works today. Ploy was a bar girl success story. She had it all. She met a Farang who swept her off her feet and took her to England and set her up with her daughter for life. Today, she is in exactly the same place she was all those years ago, desperate for money and working in a beer bar. There's an old saying that is bandied around by foreigners in Thailand and has been for years. It's still relevant today. You can take the girl out of the bar, but you can never take the bar out of the girl.